All right. So today's topic is how do you get into, restoring shoes? Because I would say it's a fun hobby most of the time. There are some projects where it's like, why do I do this? At least in my experience, there are some projects where it's like, why do I do this? You know, I don't want to do this. But for most part, there are amazing, fun projects that, it gives you a lot of creative liberty. If you're not restoring stuff and you're doing a custom, once you get that experience, it's fun. But today's video is basically just going to be, what do you need to start? The materials. But the techniques and stuff like that will be for another video. But this one, just the materials. And for the first, thing is cleaning supplies, everyone's favorite. Um, the one that I use is right here, it works, it's not flashy. It's I've used it for around like 5 years, I haven't really changed it. All the three brushes I use a lot, depending on which one. The soft brush suede, soft brush also leather, but the medium brush mainly for leather, and then the stiff brush for the soles, for the outsoles. And it does its job. Shoe trees, they do their job. For this price, I'd say my recommendation is to only buy this stuff. Like if you're gonna restock your supply, do it during Christmas time or even Black Friday. You know, because that's when it's gonna be its cheapest. Around like $40. 45 after shipping, if anything. You know, I would say this is a good buy around like $40 if you can find it for 40. But if you just need it emergency, you can get the single one, the single bottle, the big bottle for like $30. And that sounds expensive. It is. But a big bottle of this normally lasts me around a year, you know, of regular cleaning because you don't use a lot of it per cleaning. And the one of the biggest materials, once you start getting into the thick of it with restorations, is cement glue. Um, this stuff is does have chemicals, so wear a mask whenever you use it. Um, it does smell strong because it has a bunch of chemicals, mainly acetone. Acetone is very strong to the nose, and you do smell it as soon as you open that can. One thing I have to say about barge cement glue is while it is good and it works amazingly, um after a couple months it does tend to harden up, you know, or stiffen up, I would say. Um Once it gets to that point, I wouldn't recommend using it all too much because the stick does tend to get weaker the harder it gets. And once it gets to that point, I would just be like, okay, cut your losses. Because most of the times, by the time it gets to that point, if you're doing a decent amount of reglues, you know, you're gonna be able to just buy it. You should be able to just buy a new one, because you don't want to use old glue. Your jobs will become a lot worse. Like your finished product will become a lot worse, and you'll have to go back and do more touch-ups compared to like a fresher can of glue. But this is the glue that I use. It works. You're gonna hear me saying that a lot. It works. But no, this stuff really does, it does its job, and I wouldn't go for any other brand besides Barge, either Barge Infinity or Barge Super Stick. Those are the two ones that I would recommend and that a lot of people use. You know, this can, it will last you if you store it properly in a nice regulated environment. It will last you a year with no problems. But if you live in a colder area, it'll last you a couple months. And if you live in a hotter area, the same thing. It'll last you a couple months. It's kind of just it needs to be climate controlled for the most part. But yeah, 10 out of 10 glue or 9 out of 10 because, depending on where you live. Next tool, heat gun. Heat guns it doesn't matter on the brand as long as you're not getting the cheapest thing possible because, you know, especially with tools, I cannot stress this enough. Anything that has to do with electric, get something that's mid tier, like don't get anything bottom tier. If you can't afford it right now, what I can recommend is, you know, a hair dryer. Hair dryer does this job, but it just takes longer. But once you save up, let's say you're a kid in high school, you want to do this as like a side hustle. Once you save up enough money, get yourself a nice mid tier heat gun. My heat gun, I don't have the exact brand that like off the top of my head, but it was around like $25, and I've used it for around like 4 years, and not a single thing has broken. It hasn't gotten weaker. Heat guns are something you shouldn't play around with, like at all. I've burned myself with my heat gun, by accident, but they do save you a lot of time when it comes to repaints, and I would say they save you a bunch of time when it comes to reheating up uh barge cement glue because once we get into like reglues and stuff like that and how to do them, um, it's very necessary. But heat gun, don't skimp on a heat gun. It is a very important tool. I would say it's the most important tool, if not the second most important tool. Next tool would be a Dremel. Now these things do get kind of pricey. 80 bucks is, a lot, but it is a full kit, a full Dremel kit. It comes with a bunch of different bits, you know. This is the exact same one I have. One bit that I do that doesn't come with this is a triangular grip, triangular, and it's kind of like that third one besides the two beige ones, but it's for sanding, and it's very simple. Once we get past the other tools, I'll show you the exact bit. But this is a decent tool for, sanding down an area you have to glue. There's certain things you should sand down before you glue them, so that way they can get a better adhesion to the glue. And this is necessary for sole swaps because not all shoes are made to be flush with a brand new midsole or sole. So you would have to make those adjustments need be. And the Dremel is the tool for this, and it works. You're gonna hear me saying that a lot. It works. But I've had my Dremel for around 4 years, no problems. No problems besides if you hold the Dremel around its air vents, it can overheat. And if you feel the Dremel getting hot, turn it off and let it cool. If you feel something is going wrong with one of your machines, turn it off. Cannot stress this enough. Turn it off. You are playing with machinery. And it is something that you do not want to mess with because these tools can hurt you. And as long as you use them properly, um, you know, it'll be fine. But just use precaution when you're first starting out. And once I go over, how to use them in a different video, it'll make more sense. Next tool, airbrush. This is more like a luxury, I would say, because you can do all the painting by hand. Is it going to take you a long time? Yes. Does the airbrush save you time? Yes. Are airbrushes expensive? Yes. Are they a money pit? 100%. They are not fun to maintain. They are very annoying to maintain, but when they work, they are very useful. They'll save you time. For me, it's kind of a hit or miss. Sometimes it'll save me a lot of time. Sometimes it'll make me take a lot more time. Like if something messes up in an airbrush, that's another hour you have to spend figuring it out. It feels like a used car for some reason. I don't know why, but it gives me that. Whenever something goes wrong, you have to take the whole thing apart and you have to wonder what went wrong. And then when you find it, you're gonna be like, man, this was so simple to fix. But yeah, airbrushes, sometimes they're a headache, sometimes they're a lifesaver. The only time I use my airbrush is when I'm laying down a white base coat for the most part, and certain paints that are airbrush like paint. Like there's a brand we're gonna go into later on called Jacquard. It's solely for airbrushes, and if I'm laying down a white base coat, I'm using Jacquard paint, and it works like no other when it comes to base coats, and saves you a lot of time because laying down white by hand, not fun, not fun, and you can eliminate brush strokes by using an airbrush. Certain colors like green and yellow, though, will be easier to use an airbrush with because those are also annoying to lay down with a brush. Next up, who would have thought? Brushes. Um, you can use regular flat brushes to paint, but I would highly recommend using angular brushes when it comes to painting. You have a lot more control on where your paint goes or where your brush is. And once you get a steady hand, because I originally, when I started, did not have a steady hand for painting, um, once you get a steady hand, angular brushes are your best friend. You sometimes, once you get that steady hand, you won't even have to use tape to prep a paint job because that's how good these brushes are. Regular flat square brushes, I would use for reglues only. Like if you want like disposable paint brushes, get some cheap like flat airbrush, not airbrush. Get some cheap flat like flat brushes. those will be good for re-glues and like disposable brushes. Because one thing about that cement paint, going back to it, is that once it hardens, it's very annoying to clean off of a brush unless you have acetone, you know? And wow, who would have thought you need paint to paint, you know? This brand, Angelus, I'd say is the standard, for painting shoes at least. This is the brand that people have been using for years, including myself. I've have over 40 colors from them, and they work like I've never had problems with this paint. If you prep correctly, this paint is really, really good. Even some of their finishers, like the these clear coats, I've had them. They're kind of hit or miss sometimes. If you apply them through the airbrush, so far they haven't cracked for me. But if I'm applying them through a paintbrush, they have cracked. So if you do use them, airbrush, airbrush 100%. You should airbrush these onto a shoe when you're applying a clear coat. And if you're not using Angelus clear coat, just get it in. Krylon, Krylon clear finishers. Most of the times for shoes, they are either a matte finish or they are a semi-gloss finish. There are some few instances where they are satin or high gloss finish, but for the most part, you're going to be using matte, matte finish, or semi-gloss. And um, once we go into like applying clear coats, you know, there are certain ways that you would apply it so it doesn't come off as caked on, and that's how you ruin your paint job. But we'll go into that in another video once we go on how to paint shoes and stuff like that. Once we get into the nitty gritty of how to restore stuff, which I am looking forward to. And then the next stuff is, of course, masking tape because not everyone has a steady hand. You know, it's one thing I must stress is if you think you need to use tape because if you mess up your paint job, you're going to be annoyed and it's going to be annoying to fix, especially if you get it on suede every single time, unless you know that you're that guy or that woman or that they, them, you know, use tape because getting paint off of suede, it's not fun. Getting paint off of leather is also not fun. Getting paint off of anything is not very fun, you know, where if paint isn't supposed to go there, you should probably tape it off. I would normally use Scotch general purpose, not contractors, because that's just a bit too wide, but it's mainly around this length, you know. It's around $6 most of the time, like if you get it from Target and stuff like that. The next thing that you would need to use, acetone. Now, I normally use the Target brand Up and Up. Let's just actually just go to Target. Target, Target. No, use this stuff. It is a pure acetone, 100% pure. Now, when you're also using this, wear a mask. Like I said with the glue, it is not fun to inhale, Not fun. But $3, most of the time I get it for around like $2, for the larger bottle, $2. It's not bad. It lasts. I'm not gonna say it lasts a long time because, once you get into the nitty-gritty of repainting a lot of shoes or regluing a lot of shoes, you're gonna go through a lot of acetone. And for the newer shoes, acetone is fine. We'll go into a lot of what to use for different types of shoes. But for older shoes, rubbing alcohol, it's probably the next best thing. It's not as strong, but if you don't want to damage the shoe, rubbing alcohol is really good as well. And then for prepping certain things, prepping certain surfaces, tape jobs, and stuff like that, you're going to want an X-Acto knife. These things are very dangerous. Who would have thought? A very sharp blade is very dangerous, but I've cut myself, I've poked myself a couple times pretty bad. It's not fun. But as much as I dislike this tool, It is very useful for me, and I cannot stop using it because it saves me a lot of time, even if I get cut. But an X-Acto knife is good for, if you're doing a custom, taking off tags, ripping, cutting stitching, cutting tape. It's a lot. It's an all around thing that you should have. You're not going to use it all the time, but when you do, it's going to be very useful. And besides that, let's see if Jacquard will go into die later on. Jacquard paint. If you do live in the New York area, there is a store called Blick Art Studios. They sell this. They sell Blick Art Studios sells Blick Art Materials. I don't know where I'm getting Art Studios from. Um, they sell Angelus paint. You know, they sell a lot of Angelus paint. They have a bunch of locations all over the United States. If you're not in the United States, you're just gonna have to order off of the Angelus website or Amazon for Angelus paint. Same thing with Jacquard. But Jacquard paint, solid, does its thing. It's not like it's not gonna wow you, but it does its job. That's what it's there for. And when it comes to restoring shoes, as long as it does its job, you're gonna have a great time because man, when something doesn't go your way in restoring shoes, it is a pain to fix. Because it always seems like it's something catastrophic that goes wrong. It's never something minor. Never. It never is. From my experience, it's never something minor. It's always something catastrophic. You're like, man, I have to do 2 more days of work, or maybe another 5 hours of work. But overall, I believe that's all of the materials. I went over the finishes, the tools you'll need. Um, hmm. Oh, you know what? If you do get into unyellowing shoes, um, this is something you're going to need. A grow light. Sounds weird. You're not growing anything with it, but you know the light that this emits when you turn both of the switches on, it reverses the chemical reaction that oxidizes shoes. I will get into that in a different video because that is a whole process in itself, and it's kind of just I would say it's a boring one, but like you know, it's science. I don't know. Not a lot of people like science. Um, but it's fun. It's something that you can do it and then just worry about something, do something else while that on yellows. But you're gonna need one of those, uh, grow tent, and one or two exhaust fans. You don't need anything like over $100 in all honesty, unless you're crazy. But like $40, that's probably the most I'll go. $40 because you can unyellow two shoes with this. You're gonna need some grow tent exhaust fans as well because these things do get hot, and if you put a shoe in there and you're gonna have a light on it 24/7, so you're gonna need an exhaust fan to blow out the hot air and suck in cool air, so the shoe doesn't separate while it's in there. But besides that, that's all of the tools you're gonna need to. I wouldn't say start, but like these are all the tools you'll use once you get fully into restoration. Now, if you're starting out, the first thing if you don't have a lot of money, let's say you're on an allowance, or let's say you're working a part-time job, you're not gonna have a lot to just buy all this stuff outright. Some of this stuff is expensive. Airbrush, airbrush. I don't know why they make them so expensive. Um, Start off with the shoe cleaning kit. You know, if you're in high school or if you know people that need their shoes cleaned, start off with this. It'll get you used to it. You could charge them like $20, start earning your money like that as like a side hustle, save up that money, get your bar cement, start practicing with that, regluing some shoes. It's gonna be a annoying process having to wait, but once you do this, you get these two tools right here, get that, get those going, and then you can start doing reglues once you get used to it. You can start charging for reglues. Once you get really used to reglues, you can start doing your own soul swaps and vintage restorations because I would say those are the funnest. Those are the most fun things to do, vintage restorations, because they require a lot more technique, a lot more different things involved. It feels like you're bringing every technique together, which I'll go over in another video because there's a lot of techniques. I'd say unyellowing shoes is the easiest thing to get into because it's, all you need is a grow tent, a grow light, and an exhaust fan, and then actually no, let's go on Reshoot because they sell it as well. Soul Revive this. Yeah. They sell this. This is something you'll need for unyellowing. Not this exact brand. You don't need to get this. There's something also called 40 volume developer for 40 volume developer. This, you know, right here. This is what I use because, it's a big bottle, gets the job done. But let's say, you want this because it's made for shoes. This works. This definitely works. I've used it once. It's expensive for a little bottle, but it definitely does its job. Does it do it better than this? It's about the same results. Takes less time, With the unyellowing, it does. I wouldn't say it consumes a lot of electricity. When it comes to like the electric bill, and like let's say your mom is like, "Oh, stop using the electric bill," but you know, you can start contributing to the electric bill if it gets to that point because if you're gonna use electricity and a lot of it, you should probably start contributing to it because that's part of like the business if you're doing this as a side hustle. But unyellowing is probably the easiest way to start off with because it doesn't require a lot. You have your 40 volume developer cream, your grow light, your grow tent, and your exhaust fan, and also clear wrap. This. Not this is just a general example. You're gonna once we go into the process of actually unyellowing shoes, this is gonna be really useful, but this is the last tool you'll need. And once you do that, you can just start unyellowing shoes. It's going to take a long time because some people use their shoes a lot and they're expecting brand new results. And once we get into unyellowing, it's not gonna be like that. But other than that, I would rank getting into unyellowing the easiest, cleaning shoes the second easiest, painting shoes. I clicked on this. Painting shoes, the third easiest. Then you're gonna get into root glues. That's gonna get a little bit hard. Then you're gonna get into sole swaps. That's gonna be a lot harder and a lot more cost consuming because you need a donor shoe in order to do sole swaps. But all of these are definitely they all come together once you actually do a full on restoration, and I would say they're pretty fun, once you get everything done. But these are all the things you'll need. Um, in separate videos, I'll go into different techniques. I'm gonna split them off into one separate video per. But other than that, thank you for watching.